Welcome, people. It's a real pleasure to have you all with us today. Uh, Make sure you turn off your cell phones if you have them on. Uh, we won't. We have plenty of time, but we don't want to waste time waiting for you to cut it off. If you go ahead and do that now, we appreciate it. But it's a real pleasure, and we're delighted that things working out so that we can restart the brown bags. And today is kind of an anniversary because I remember one of the first time that we had Wayne with us. It was down at the library, and it was following the election of Jesse Ventura as governor of Minnesota. And it was a shocking sort of thing. And in order to get the audience's attention and make sure everything was okay, I thought it would be best if we adopted Wayne as a native of Sylacauga. And we did that. It was 100% vote by acclamation, Wayne, if you remember. And since that time, he's been, that was 23 years ago. And so he's been here every year for 23 years, and he'll probably be here for the next 23. But you all know that Dr. Flynt is a famous historian, a famous preacher, and a famous man with a compass and knowing his north from his south. And it's important in today's society that people have a compass like that. A moral compass is more important than the directional compass. And he has furnished that for the state of Alabama. Uh, he's published many books. He's done many exciting things. He's represented Alabama real well. And we're just delighted to have him here today to do this story on the migration of one family from Clay County to Sylacauga, Alabama. And since he's a part of it, Wayne, we want you to know that we're welcoming you back home. Dr. Flynt.
I have somebody in my Sunday school class whose sole function is to hook me up and turn me on. And so if I come to Sylacauga, she's much prettier than the guy who does this in my Sunday school class. This is 5 volumes from which I have winnowed what I'm going to tell you today. But there are 2 more volumes that have the photographs, and which were used to make the slides that you're going to see. So there are actually 7 volumes of genealogy and stories, which my brother-in-law put together. He was the Alabama State geologist for many years and did an awful lot of geological research all over Alabama. But basically, he did interviews and looked at documents after he retired of all the people I'm going to talk about. And these are his documents. And I'm telling you that so you can come and look. He's also a wonderful artist, an award-winning artist who's won all sorts of juried prizes after his geological career. And the thing I want to emphasize about him is he is not an historian. Just an ordinary guy interested in his family. And he interviewed everyone who was still alive, whom I'm going to talk about. So everyone I'm going to talk about is essentially the product of a process of migration, all of them living in northern Talladega or western Talladega County, northern Tallapoosa County, Coosa County, and Clay County. So 4 counties. Essentially, if you think of it as a quadrangle, Little Hillaby Creek is where the family began. And then they're involved in Ashland and Lineville in Clay County. Then they moved from Millersville into Sylacauga. And so think of this as a quadrant with Coosa, Tallapoosa, Talladega, and Clay counties, this little patch of the world. And all of this story is sort of like a biblical story of a place you've never been to in the Bible. But when you get through listening to this, you can see it as clearly as you see one of Craig Brown's sculptures and how he brings the life out of this. I tried to think, how do you title this? And the title I gave Ted and Shirley is sort of an awkward title, but I got to thinking about it, and it's no more awkward than the picture with which we started of me 23 years ago, I think it was, Ted. First come into the Sylacauga Library, which is my all-time favorite place to speak to people. And I do this all the time, all over the world. And the very best place I go is Sylacauga. And that photograph was actually made 23 years ago. But if you noticed, I haven't changed at all. If you believe that, you're really going to like these stories. I had a student from Samford University, one of my best students, who did a PhD at the University of Florida, then came back to Alabama and taught in Alabama. And while he was here in Alabama, he began a project, tragically never completed because he died of brain cancer at 42 years old. But it was a massive project doing oral histories, which I had begun at Samford with ordinary people, many of them textile workers in my wife's family. And you'll understand why that's so important as I go along today. Eddie did a number of oral histories with textile workers in Alexander City and especially in Sylacauga, also in Eufaula, and also up in Jackson County in Scottsboro, where there was another one of the Comer Mills. And Ed's parents had worked in the mill up in Jackson County. So it was his love for the world that was provided for him and the education, first generation college student at Samford, and then a really wonderful historian. But he never finished the project. He was doing this massive project on Comer's textile empire in Alabama. He died before he could ever do it. So in a sense, this is sort of a continuation of what Eddie Aiken began, and some of the oral histories of his I have used in this, but many of these are my own oral histories as well. I thought about naming this Imperfect Families, because although we would like to memorialize our families by saying they're perfect, we all know they're not. They're flawed. And if you do genealogical research and family history, one of the great dangers is that you are disillusioned if you spend enough time listening to the stories that are told about your ancestors. But nonetheless, you can think of this as a sort of portal that is an entry point to try to understand who you are by understanding who your ancestors were, how you're like them, how you're not like them. And also, as you understand these stories, you will understand that they are part of a much larger story. So if you enter this portal, you all of a sudden find yourself in a world like sort of Oz or Alice in Wonderland, where the world you enter becomes much larger as you move through the door and you begin to expand the levels of people you're talking about. Then I thought of another name that probably was a better title for what I'm going to do today: Ordinary People and Their Extraordinary Lives. So, as you know, I spent much of my life writing about working class and poor whites, textile mill workers, pulpwood workers, coal miners, steel workers, tenant farmers, recreating history from the bottom up rather than creating history from the top down, which is the way it's normally done. So I spent most of my life working on my own families and my wife's families and families like them from across Alabama. And so they're ordinary people, but their lives are not at all ordinary. Every one of their lives is extraordinary, different from everyone else's life. Then I thought about, well, there's even a better biblical title for this called Amazing Grace, and you'll see the reason for that in just a minute. One other thing I want to help you think about today is when I'm done, you're going to say, well, what was the theme of what he said? And so I'm going to start with the theme so you can process the facts into the theme. So this is a big umbrella at the first, and everything's going to have to fit in this. The first theme is that people who live the lives that I'm going to describe to you are characterized by incredible resilience. They get battered, which is a human characteristic for all of us, but they are resilient when they're battered, and that's not necessarily a universal characteristic at all. Everyone is battered, but not everyone is resilient. The second thing I'd say about them is that almost all these people had a very strong level of resentment. They resented their fate, they resented the way they were treated, and they mostly thought they deserved something better, which was true in some cases and not true in others. They were flawed. So some of them probably got pretty much what they deserved, and a lot of them didn't get anything near what they deserved. And then the third thing, which seems entirely inconsistent with the details of their lives that I'm going to give you, is that they had a tremendous sense of pride. I know it's really incomprehensible that someone in 1923 who could barely read and write and came into work at Mignon Mills would have had an enormous sense of personal pride, but they did. And that was part of the bumping up of people who ran the mill, supervised the mill, and prideful people who came in and knew they weren't very smart and didn't have much education, but they had an enormous sense of pride. So don't think because they're poor, they don't have a sense of pride. And then I sort of morphed from those themes to this set of themes. Number one, life is procreative. That is, you create and you want to create. You have children, you marry, you have children. That's procreative. But you also know life ends in death. So you want to build something out of your life, create something in your life, but you know you're going to be gone sooner or later. And in between that procreative stage of creating and that stage of passing on, there is joy. I mean, there's joy in everybody's life somewhere along the line. And there's tragedy, which, that's the reason why, if you love theater, there's one mask that is a smile and one mask that is a tragedy, a frown and a smile. And that is because the ancient Greeks understood what I'm trying to tell you, which is you begin life, you try to create something, you die, and in between, there are moments of great joy and moments of great tragedy. Now, having started off with really deep stuff, I mean, if you want to go home now, you can go home and just think about everything I've said. Now, what I want to do is to try to fill that in with some concrete people in Sylacauga, Alabama. As a young Baptist minister, I had a lot of faults, but the worst fault I had was judgmentalism. I know that's surprising that you ever heard of a Baptist preacher who was judgmental, but nonetheless, that's true. And as I became an historian and a biographer and a writer, it sort of took the edges off my judgmentalism. Although some people are better than other people, I never met a person who was perfect. Not a single one. Not even my wife, who was closer than anyone else. Now, you examine your family lives, process them by name, by who, when they were there, when they died. If you process them, you will probably conclude that it is one thing to judge a person. It is altogether a different thing to try to understand them before you judge them. So the issue is not your judgment, because that's easy enough to do, because everybody makes mistakes. But the question is, can you process your judgment or your judgmentalism through the prism of understanding how they got to be where they are? So I'm going to tell you some things that if relatives in this room of the people I tell you about are here, they're going to be offended. I'm not offended by this, because we live our lives and there is tragedy and there is great joy. And we process this through the prism of everybody is imperfect. That's a good Baptist concept called original sin, if you don't recognize it from your pastor. John Washington Smith is a name that's pretty easy to remember. It's the first slide that's up here. I'm going to show you John. There he is. He's sort of the patriarch of the family. He was born in 1848. No, that's 58. I was right the first time. 1858. He was born in the upper part of Tallapoosa County. His father went off to war in 1861. He was in the 35th Georgia Regiment, so they just crossed the river, and he was over in Georgia, and he fought with that regiment until December of 1862, when he died of wounds after a major Confederate victory. So his son, John Washington, was actually 4 years old when he died, which meant that the mother raised the children by herself. And he is the patriarch. His wife here had serious mental problems, and if you notice, she slumped over. So part of the tragedy of his life was a wife who was essentially having tremendous mental problems. This is Harris, and I'm going to have another slide of him a little closer. This is his wife, Julia, and this is my father-in-law, W. Albert Smith, when he was just a little kid. So you got this family torn apart by the Civil War. You got this part of the family with Harris and his wife, Julia. And this looks like a fairly common, ordinary Southern family. Not well-to-do, but dressed to the nines for this photograph. But this is not what their life was like at all. As a matter of fact, John, the patriarch of the family, was born in a house that is still extant. It's about 9 miles south of Ashland on County Road 9, off the main road. You have to go down a wiggly road and walk in the woods a ways to get to the house. But the house is still there and obviously a state of disrepair. I tried to reduce the lives to places you would understand. The second slide is a little bit more precise. This is Harris. This is my father-in-law, Albert, and this is his wife, Julia. And I want you to just pay attention to that because I want you to try to visualize in your own mind what, say, Kroger does in a piece of marble from Sylacauga. What do I want to do with this? How do I want to interpret this physical reality into something that's mental? And I could ask you all sorts of questions and we could have wonderful discussions if we had time. Do you think that looks like a happy couple or an unhappy couple? Do you think she looks less happy than he's happy? Obviously, Albert is full of possibilities. And Albert doesn't know what Albert is going to be. He became a Baptist preacher, but you don't really need to know that. Except that Albert, who became the Baptist preacher, and my father-in-law, was one of the most pious and honorable men I ever knew. And he came from one of the most dysfunctional families in this place, in this world. So you understand, children can outgrow their parents, right? And even one parent can outgrow another parent, which is a really important part of this. They lived on Hillaby Creek, Little Hillaby, actually, not Hillaby proper, but Little Hillaby. And the house where he was born, still there in Millersville. His wife, that is John's wife, Martha Adeline Nixon Smith, is buried at Millersville. And I'm going to talk about Millersville over and over again because it's just barely less important than Sylacauga to this story. Julie Catchins, who is the woman here, was from a family in Coosa County, Tallapoosa County line, really, Little Hillaby Creek. Harris, her husband, struggled all of his life, and he struggled in multiple ways. But for one thing, after he married Julia and they had 4 children, at this point in time, there's only one child because Albert was the oldest, but there were 3 more children that followed. In addition to that, Harris had taken in much of what was left of his own family. So he had siblings, and he had taken them in after his parents died. And so it's a blended family, some of his own children and then some of his siblings. And they lived on a very small farm near Millerville, 12, 15 acres. So it's barely enough just to have a garden and grow a little corn. And so they're subsistence farmers, essentially. He also had a very serious drinking problem. I guess probably in modern parlance, you would say he was an alcoholic. He also had a furious temper. Not unusual, except that in poor families, the way in which this is realized is typically more physical. But his anger just exploded. There are all sorts of family stories, and I do a lot of oral history. Just take a tape recorder and record stories. And so here are some of the stories. I'll tell you more of them later. According to this story, his wife, Julia Catchings, was sitting out on her back porch, and there's a mountain nearby, and I'll show you the place where all these come from in just a minute. In fact, let's go ahead and do that now. Go ahead and pull those up. Both these, go back to the first, yeah, that one, yeah, right. This gives you a spatial location of this. This is the road to Sylacauga. This is Bull Gap. This is Hatchet Creek, one of my favorite places in all the world. Running down toward 280 this way. Goodwater is here. Hollins is here. And this is generally where Harris lived. The general area of Albert, and that's my father-in-law. This was the area where he lived. And so this is at the foot of Rebecca Mountain, which gives you a good idea of what the land was like. They do call Clay County for a reason. It's got a lot of clay. It's not like the Black Belt, and they didn't grow a lot of cotton. It's basically subsistence agriculture, moonshining up the hollows every now and then. Okay, next slide. Thank you. And this is Midway, and that is where my mother-in-law grew up. And you can see Albert's farm here, and here she lives here. And this is going to be an important story when I get to Sylacauga and the class of 1927 at Sylacauga High School. But keep in mind, these two people, though they don't know each other, Albert's growing up here, and Grace is growing up here. Annie Grace is growing up here. Annie Grace, don't you love the name? Grace, for obvious reasons. And this is Alexander City and so forth. And so you get the general layout. And that's that quadrangle that I was talking about. Everything that happens, I'm going to tell you about, happened in this quadrangle. And they all wind up in Sylacauga at the end of the story. Harris' drinking problems was manifested in many ways, but one of them was physical violence. If I were a psychologist, I'd say you have to understand the world he came from. And if you understand the world he came from, you understand how limited his possibilities of dealing with his problems were. And so he drowned those problems in alcohol, not unusual among ordinary white families, frustrated and angry and not feeling any way out of their situations. One day, Julia was sitting on the back porch, right at the foot of the mountain here. And you remember those little push cars that they had on railroads? And, you know, there'd be two guys, one over here and one over here, and they would check tracks. They'd, go up and down the track so your train didn't go off the track. And they would repair things as ties rotted and so forth. In this case, Harris's house, the Smith house, was on the hill, and then up the hill was the railroad track running from Ashland to Sylacauga. And she was shelling peas, and she was sitting out on the porch shelling peas, and she was watching. I mean, all the women in this audience can tell you how boring certain housework is. And shelling peas is pretty good. I mean, you got a big sack of peas and you're shelling them. And all of a sudden, these two guys are up there and they stop and they're working on this track. So she's watching them. Harris comes in from the fields from working and he flies into a rage because he said, "You just sit out here back of the house and watch these men." And he goes and gets a hammer and nails, and he nails up the back door so she can't get out. the back of the house. I know the women are processing this in a way somewhat different from the men, but nonetheless, even the men can understand this. Also, shortly after that, he flew into a rage when he was drunk, and he hit his wife. So there's physical abuse. Not only that, but it escalates because the second oldest of the boys in the family went and got his shotgun, the family shotgun, and brought it down the stairs and said, "If you hit my mother one more time, I'll blow your brains out." And needless to say, Harris stopped hitting his wife. But the next day, his wife took the 4 children and moved into Sylacauga to get away from what she considered to be the real threat to her physical presence. Julia and Harris were never divorced. Julia went to work in 1923 when she moved into town at Mignon Mills, and then gradually all 4 of the children began to work at Mignon Mills. So there are 5 members of the family living in a much better place because of Mignon Mills. However else you judge their lives, she was one heck of a lot better off, and so were her 4 children in Sylacauga with the opportunity of Comer's Mill than they would have been with a daily threat to the wife's life and to the children's welfare. Meanwhile, Harris took a common law wife. He never divorced, but there was a common law wife, and he had a second family. And when my brother-in-law began doing all these, growing up in a Baptist preacher's family, as he did, his father was a Baptist preacher, you can imagine walking for the first time on the porch of the children of the second family and beginning to ask them about their father, who was their grandfather, that is my brother-in-law's grandfather, and trying to reconstruct this story with a fair vision of what life was like for Harris. I never really decided when preparing my notes for today whether to tell you the story, the end of the story here, or save this for a really dramatic close to the session. And I finally decided I would just tell you the story here. When my father-in-law, Albert, died in 1966, the funeral was held here, and my father-in-law and mother-in-law are buried in the Sylacauga Cemetery down on the Talladega Highway. And Darty's maternal family is buried in the downtown cemetery. And I'll tell you about that part of the family in just a minute. But when Harris came for the funeral of his father, came to Sylacauga for the funeral of his father, came in from the country, he did not recognize Julia, his first wife, at all. You could just tell, his eyesight was bad, and he was in bad health, already losing his vision, and he didn't recognize Julia. But Julia, who had lived all of her life with her oldest son, Albert, moving from place to place on his pastoral ministry, which created a sort of interesting side story of itself. How would you like to be the wife of Albert, always having to take care of your parents who are living with you as they move from one church to another and from one state to another? And there was a certain level of resentment from my mother-in-law at the fact that she never had her children and her husband by herself in her entire life. And so Harris comes in for the funeral, does not recognize Julia. Julia recognizes him. He is bent. He is spent by his life. He's exhausted by his life. And that is when my brother-in-law reconnected with him and reconnected with his half-brothers, half-sisters in the other part of the family. 2 years later, blind and almost deaf, he hanged himself in his barn, just sort of finishing the trajectory of this one part of the life of these people. The story gets really better from here on out. Next slide. This is my father-in-law growing up. He is at Howard College when this was taken. And the reason he's at Howard College is because of Donald Comer. He was one of the 4 children, you remember, mother and the 4 children work at Mignon Mills. And it took him 4 years on a small scholarship, which Donald Comer provided for him because he was very smart. And Comer recognized the tragedy of their lives. And so he particularly paid attention to Albert. And the result of that was that Albert spent 1 year in school, and then he would work in Mignon Mill for a year. And then he would spend another year in school and another year at Mignon Mill. So he's on a kind of scholarship system of work scholarship. And he graduates in 1927 as valedictorian of Mignon High School. And then Mr. Comer gives him a scholarship, a partial scholarship to Howard College because he wanted to be a Baptist preacher. So he goes to Howard College, and based on a partial scholarship from Donald Comer and his work preaching at churches and pastoring churches all through Jefferson County, he was able to go to seminary. He goes to seminary in the 1930s during the Great Depression. He marries his classmate from the class of 1927 at Mignon High School, Annie Grace House. I'll tell you about her family in just a minute, but Annie Grace, truly remarkable woman, very quiet, very deferential toward her husband, but she was the salutatorian at Mignon High School. So she was number 2 in the class. So number 1 marries number 2 in the 1927 graduating class. And during the 1930s, she's really the key to the family because she works while he goes to seminary. And one of the most tragic stories of the oral histories I did was they had gotten down to 1 dime 1 week. And she decided the 1 dime, she had some cornmeal, and she decided that the 1 dime would be best spent by buying some buttermilk. And you know the rest of the story. It's cornbread. That's what's in the window here. She gets some buttermilk to make some cornbread. And while she's coming back where they lived, there was a wire fence, and she had to crawl through or under or over this wire fence. And as she bent over to try to get through the wires of the fence, she spilled the buttermilk and lost the 10 cents worth of buttermilk, which was the only money they had. So this was a hard luck family. When he graduated seminary, his first pastorate was at Bon Air. And you all know where Bon Air is, but maybe you've forgotten that there was a Comer mill there, a small mill there. And so he goes from working in the mill to pay his way through high school to then go into college partly on the largesse of the Comer family, then going on to seminary, hard times in the 1930s, and immediately his first church is at Bon Air, a continuation of the mill life that he had encountered, but which also made the opportunity for his life. Let's go into the next slide. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There he is on the second football team of Mignon High School, and they call this team the Mignon Midgets. they don't look like midgets to me in the contemporary world of 1927, but that is in fact what he encountered as his athletic life during his academic career. Next slide. At this point, I'm going to shift the trajectory from the maternal wing of my family, who basically got here in 1923 and finished high school in 1927, to the maternal ancestors of my wife. This is Mr. Lou House, L.A. House, and this is his wife, Mary. Or this is what you would have seen if you had lived here during the end of their lives. She was married at age 14. She grew up in Shelby County, a family of sharecroppers. And she said, all I ever wanted to do was to get away from Shelby County. And she said, a man who was a sharecropper, who was older than she was, proposed marriage, and at age 14, she married. And when I was doing the oral history with her here in Sylacauga, the way she's described this, I said, when were you married? And she said, I was married at 14. Married real young, long pause, been married all my life. And in fact, she had 3 husbands. Her first husband died and is buried in the Sylacauga City Cemetery. Before he died, he bought a plot. He did not work at the mill, she did. And they bought a plot, and he was on the left side, she was on the right side of the plot. He died and was buried in his grave, and she remarried, and that marriage was a good marriage, like the first marriage, but didn't last very long. He died, so he is buried in the cemetery too. And she would sometimes go out to the cemetery, and she met a man at the cemetery, and the man was her husband, ultimately, Lou House. And he worked at the casket factory, which is just to the northwest of Sylacauga. And if I had had the room in my car, I would have brought the table we have that he made. Have you ever seen a spool table? That is the spool that thread goes on. And you think about how many spools would you have to have of those little wood spools in order to make 4 legs for a table, and then cut the wood from cedar. Now remember where he works. He works at the casket factory. And imagine how much trim wood there is when you're building caskets. Or maybe you can't imagine that, because it's not really something you would have studied. But when you cut the lumber, there are pieces of lumber that are left over. In this case, our piece is about that big, and it's about 3 feet long. So you've got this beautiful piece of cedar. Then you've got 2 cross legs toward the bottom, and on each side there are spools, wooden spools. And this is a spool table. And I counted them, and there are 120 wooden spools of thread, which I'm sure came from the mill. And each one of these spools then represents a part of a man's life as he constructs this table. It's one of our great treasures, folk art, but folk art of a very creative mind, a very creative level. And this was part of the world which they lived in. That is, you throw nothing away. There's no such thing as a scrap. A scrap is something you either eat or you use, one of the two. But all scraps are used because everything is valuable. And as I was listening to Mrs. House tell me these stories, I said, how did you meet Mr. House? And she said, oh, it was just a pure accident, Wayne. He said, we met at the cemetery. I said, yeah, that'd be kind of a unusual accident. She said, we were grieving over our spouses because it turned out that his grave and his wife's grave were right beneath the graves of Mrs. House. And so here's the man, here is Mrs. House's grave, and here is Mr. House's wife, and here is his plot. So he's coming out to mourn his wife, she's coming out to mourn her husband, and they meet each other. It so happened that they both went to Mignon Baptist Church, the Mill Village Church. And as they talked out at the cemetery and told stories about their lives, they became more and more interested in each other. And finally, they began to court. Now, remember, she's already been married twice. He's been married once. These are not youngsters. These are people in their 50s. And they began to pass notes to each other inconspicuously, because there were some people who felt that when your spouse died, you never should marry again. I know that's rare, but it was true in a Baptist church occasionally. And so people might take a dim view, especially if your spouse had not been dead very long. And so secretly, clandestinely, they would walk out of church together, sat next to each other, they walk out of church together, and clandestinely, she would put a note in his pocket, suit, of course. And she would put a note in his pocket, a note that would say something like, meet me at the cemetery at 4:00. And their courting, as she described it, their courting was the cemetery courting, because that's where they were trying to avoid embarrassing themselves or creating scandalous stories. I know it's hard for us to believe that would be a scandalous story, but nonetheless, to avoid scandal in the Baptist church and amongst their children, they courted with notes passed in pockets after Sunday worship about meeting at the cemetery. And the wonderful thing about this is they had a beautiful marriage, obviously no children, but a wonderful marriage. And Mr. House, when he died in his 90s, we had been to see him here in Sylacauga. He was over toward the Mill Village. And he, when we arrived, he was, I think, 91 at the time. And he had a ladder against a fruit tree in his yard. And he had climbed up the ladder with a saw to saw off a dead limb. And when we arrived, he was up in the tree with the ladder there. And I need to preface this by telling you that when my son came home from Seattle this summer, one of the things he told me, Dad, you're about to be 81. Do not get up on the ladder. And I promise you, I was tempted to say, David, mind your own business. And do you realize your great-grandfather was up on that fruit tree at 91, cutting off a limb? Not that I'm proposing that for any of you. I'm just telling you that I don't like to be told by my sons what I can and cannot do. Mrs. House lived after he was older, and she lived for a few years after him. And that's when I did a whole series of oral histories with her. And one of the things she said, I will never forget. She said, I told you that my husband was buried on the left side and that my grave was on the right side. And she said, I did not tell you that Mr. House's grave was on the right side and his wife was on the left side. And so I'm buried at the side of my second husband and at the feet of my, she's buried at the feet of my third husband. And she said, there's something about that I really like. And I thought, I don't know what about that you would really like, but okay, if that's the way you want to be buried. The last time we visited her, she was in her mill house, and this was a mill house behind Mignon Mill. And it was, as you know, that's an area that has really declined. It was really kept up well by the textile workers, but then when the textile industry died, it sort of became like a slum area of Sylacauga, as you know. And she was in one of the houses, and it was a rough neighborhood at the time, and trucks that were on, all the tires were gone. They were sitting up on a frame, and I, we stayed for a while. And I said, Miss House, do you think it's really safe to live in this neighborhood? And she said, well, there's trouble occasionally, and there's basically, spousal conflict and so forth, kids going wild. And she said, but I really don't worry about living here. And I said, do you have any way of protecting yourself? Do you have an alarm system or anything? She said, I have an alarm system. I said, well, could I see your alarm system just to make sure it's working okay? And she opens the door and she pulls out the biggest pistol I've ever seen. It must have been that long. And she looked at me and she said, if there's any wild thing comes around, I just shoot it. She said, she's, I think, 89 at the time. Uh, what do you make of all these stories? What do you make of all these stories? Um, blended families where you've got a common law marriage and bastard children and father who hangs himself and you've got a valedictorian from Mignon High School and a salutatorian, and they all come from the most ordinary of ordinary people. And here's what I would suggest you might think about this. That ordinary people are not ordinary in any sense whatsoever, nor are you ordinary, nor is anyone ordinary. You're extraordinary in some way, for some purpose, has some meaning. If you understand a life, there is no such thing as an ordinary person because we're just all different. And so to say someone is extraordinary suggests that they're outside the realm of our expectation of what a human being is. Not really. That is, each one of you is as extraordinary as you can possibly be. So, President Biden is no more extraordinary than you are. It's just that you are extraordinary in a different way than being president of the United States. And who the heck wants to be president of the United States? Not me. I'd rather be extraordinary in some other way, which is both a historical principle of how you recreate the lives of ordinary people, like the people who worked in the mill in Sylacauga, and also extraordinary people who are still alive in this audience, which is a theological principle, but also a very meaningful historical principle. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes, and I would sort of like to just hear your reactions, thoughts, questions. Most of these people I realize you probably never even heard of and certainly didn't know.
I can remember being down to 10 cents. I'm not that old, but I can remember being down to 10 cents.
You do?
Yes, sir.
Wow. I was hoping that somebody here would remember them. Any of the rest of you know LA House, Lou House? This, yeah, good. You did. That's really good. I'm glad the memories are still there. Yes.
I think it was very interesting the way you portrayed the Comers as being so aware of him being an exceptional person not long ago, I wanted to write an article for a little local paper about B.B. Comer's school. And I went down, I called and asked if they had some memorabilia that I could look at. And I went down, and they graciously took me upstairs to the high school library and filled a table with boxes of memorabilia. You would have loved it.
I would have loved it.
You would have loved it, and you could probably still do that if you have the energy and the time to do it. In this literature, and that's the only way I can say it, it was just pure poetry. Looking through the first principal of Mignon School had kept carefully files of correspondence with the Comer family. And they corresponded about such things as, my staff really loved the Christmas baskets that you sent. And then Mr. Comer, on the other hand, had written him back, thank you for your word. We got your Christmas card, and we appreciate hearing from you. And the thing that struck me about all of this stuff, and that there's some yearbooks from those early years too that you might like to look through. But the thing that struck me was the way they were so respectful of each other. That was Mr. J.P. Creel, and Mr. Comer was constantly telling him, you are definitely the best person for this job, and we appreciate the moral compass that with which you are leading the school. And he would thank him, and it was back and forth, their courtesy to each other. And you got the feeling that the school was built on much more than just academics, but it was built on their mutual admiration for each other. And I loved it.
Some of you probably didn't hear what she was saying, but it's important enough. I'm going to summarize it. She went to B.B. Comer, right, and they had records from Mignon School and B.B. Comer, lots of records, including correspondence between Mr. Comer and people who worked there. This is not surprising to me, but it is surprising. It was surprising to my graduate student from Scottsboro, because he wouldn't make this into an argument of mill workers, like historians have done, mill workers versus bosses. And Lord knows there were plenty of sweatshops all over the South which had that kind, and I think of Gastonia, North Carolina, as being the worst place, where there was no sense of paternalism, no sense of kindness, no sense of interaction, just, what is the bottom line at the end of each year? And that was a center of the American Communist Party, and one of the most divided and violent towns in America in the 1930s was the mill workers in Gastonia and the bosses, because there was a disconnection between them. Whereas the Comers were not disconnected. They were Methodist, and they were deeply Christian Methodist. And as you may or may not know, Donald Comer was actually the head of the relief program for the state of Alabama during the 1930s, appointed by the governor. And one reason Alabama didn't have the violence, because it had all the possibilities. The Communist Party had organized the United Mill, Mine, and Smelter Workers Union in Birmingham. The Communist Party, working out of Birmingham, had come all the way down. There were socialists all the way organizing lumber workers, especially blacks, all the way down to Auburn. And so we had the potential for that kind of class division. And when my graduate student began to do the interviews, he was stunned by the fact that the stories about the Comers were not bad, because the literature of the textile owners and the textile workers all through the textile belt from North Carolina to Alabama, and Alabama was one of the largest textile producers, and one of the tragedies is what's happened to all those textile towns once that industry moved to China and other places. But the interesting thing about that is the Comers are an exception. They don't fit the pattern. And I attribute that altogether just to the fact that they were really decent people. And I'll tell you one last story. Mrs. L.A. House, when she went to work in the mill, and this is after her second husband died, she went to work in the mill, and she did not particularly like mill work. Some people relished it, gave them independence. Some people didn't. She had kids, and independence is not really what she wanted. She wanted to be home with the kids, but she had to go to work in the mill. So she goes to work in the mill, and she has a certain sense of resentment. You remember that word I used at the beginning, that almost all these people resent where they are in life because they just think God or somebody really messed with them. They were better than their fate. And so she had a real sense of anger and animosity, that this is what she had been reduced to by the death of her husband and the fact she had 3 kids' mouths to feed. She goes to work in a mill, and one day she was working, spinning, and the threads kept breaking. And all of a sudden, over her shoulder, of course, she's having to take this thread off and refit it, and she's supposed to have a certain production each day, and the thread keeps breaking. And she hears this male voice over her shoulder saying, "What's wrong with that thread?" And she says, without even looking, "Oh, it's just rotten. It's the only kind of combers will ever buy." And no response, just, and then she hears a laugh, kind of like that laugh. And she didn't even turn around. She's working to put it back on. Whoever this guy is behind her, and he walks off. And the person next to her, the woman next to her, said, "Oh my God, do you know who that was? That was Donald Comer." And she said the whole rest of that day, and I want you to think about what I'm about to say. The whole rest of that day, the only thing I could think of was that I was going to come to work tomorrow and I was not going to have a job. And I had 3 mouths to feed. And of course, nothing happened. Nothing happened. Which tells you a lot about the fact that Donald Comer didn't feel threatened by his workers because he tried to treat them, maybe not from the standpoint of some labor historians, but he tried to treat them with respect and dignity. And if he had fired her, that would have suggested that the predominant story of labor historians is actually universal in the South, even for people like the Comers, when in fact it was not. You really do have to divide these people. And the best evidence of that is the fairly high regard for textile workers in Sylacauga. They're not generally referred to as lint heads. And Mrs. House once told me, and here's the class part of this, she once told me, if it wasn't for us lint heads, there wouldn't be anybody in Sylacauga having supper tonight with meat on the table. And what she meant was that in 1923, there wasn't much town in Sylacauga. And when that mill came here, it created a kind of magnet that drew people from all over, Talladega, Coosa, Clay County, drew them all into Sylacauga. And then all of a sudden, stores started. All the stores are closed now because they all moved out to 280. But back when old 280 was there, going through Millerville, and all of a sudden the mill opened and drew all those people from all those places I've described today into Sylacauga. Lawyers had more customers, and doctors had more customers, and businesses on Main Street had more customers. And what she said was, modern Sylacauga ain't about all the big families who lived here a long time ago. It was about all of us who came between 23 and 27 and went to work and spent the money. Lived in a mill town, but spent the money here and created this town. So from her standpoint, Sylacauga is about the mill workers, which is not necessarily the way most people understand Sylacauga. And a lot of them think of the mill workers as sort of how shall I phrase this, Krager? Sort of a foreign element that we would have been better off without, because they brought all sorts of, blended families, bastard children, common law marriages. Well, yeah, that did happen. Sometimes among wealthy families, but sometimes among poor families. And what I'm saying is, modern Sylacauga is basically a composite of two worlds. The wonderful worlds of people who've lived here and been in families here and built this town for 200 years. And then from 1923 to 27, this new world. And don't characterize them as lint heads. They didn't like that. And they as the life of Albert Smith and the other people I've talked about pretty well demonstrates, there were good people and bad people. Thank you very much. Y'all have been a wonderful audience.
Does anybody else have any more questions or comments for Dr. Flynt?
I say Miss House died probably 20 years ago. Mr. House died a couple of years before she did. Get my microphone off. 20 years ago, 22 years ago, I'd say she's been dead about 20 years and he's been dead about 22 years, 23 years. Albert Smith died in 1966. His father, Harris, died in 1968. He's the one who hanged himself. So these are not ancient ancestors, but if you take them back to John Washington, it's a pretty interesting story. And I also remind people all the time, Harris, who turned out to be not so great a man, but he was, his father was killed in the war when he was 4 years old. So he was without a father, and thus the kind of model, a male model, when he was growing up. So I cut Harris a little bit of slack for his alcoholism and his temper and his divorce and his common law, or not his divorce, his common law family. I cut him a little bit of slack. I guess the older I get, the more slack I cut people.
Dr. Flynt, what other churches did your father-in-law preach?
Dr. Smith pastored Bonaire, then he pastored First Baptist Fairfax, so he's following the textile trail. And there are people in Fairfax who still remember him or still alive. Then he went to the Tennessee Valley and he pastored First Baptist in Sheffield. And then from Sheffield, he went to East Gadsden Baptist Church. And from East Gadsden Baptist Church, he went to Arab First Baptist Church and died of cancer, 1960s. I'm not sure of the date, but 1960s. But all of his pastorates in his real career were in Alabama. He pastored churches in Texas while he was in seminary, but all of his real church congregations, most of them, as you can tell, were mill churches or factory churches, steel workers, textile workers, Goodyear tire and rubber workers in Gadsden. So he remained true to the people from whom he came. And not the greatest preacher I ever heard, but probably the best man.
Do we have any more? Dr. Flynt, thank you so much. And I just want to remind y'all, I know Dr. Ted gave you a wonderful introduction, but it is so nice to be able to have Dr. Flynt back in Sylacauga. He is one of the icons in Southern history, and we just want to thank you so much for making time to come share your story with us. And you asked what the takeaway would be. And I think I just hope one day, if this is ever my story, that somebody will be as kind as you've been and whitewash it a little bit for me. But you've done a fantastic job.
Write your story.
Thank you all so much for coming. I do want to mention again, we have some great sponsors. Mr. Chris is back there, First Bank of Alabama. We want to thank y'all so much for always being such a good sponsor. Of course, the Hickory Street Cafe with the great cookies. I do want to thank Dr. Shirley Spears in the back, because Dr. Flynt is here because she asked, because he's got such a good, close relationship with her, and we appreciate all she does for the library. I also want to remind you, next week on Wednesday, we have a couple of ladies coming from the Muscle Shoals Music Foundation. One of the ladies is actually the wife of one of the Swampers, and so they're going to come do a great program on the Muscle Shoals music era. So we hope you'll come back and join us again. Thank you all so much, and we will. Sure.
Hard to believe that all this everything I've said today came from these 5 volumes and 2 more volumes. But those of you who are doing genealogical family research, you can see what a masterful kind of work it can be if you're willing to spend the time to do it. And Everett's a wonderful artist, so you've got some good illustrations too.
Thank you all so much. Thank you again, Dr. Flynt.